Good morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning in and to the worship this morning. Happy Mother's Day to all of our mothers that are watching this morning. If you don't mind to stay around, at the end of the playlist, we have a special video for our mothers, courtesy a lot of the kids here at Helton. So if you're a mother and you're watching this, please stay around for that, and I hope you enjoy that. So this morning for our sermon, I want to talk about lament. Lamentation, the idea that we get from Scripture. Now, in a couple of the past sermons, I've kind of hinted at and mentioned that this is something I wanted to do, and finally I just decided, why not? And you think about, like, why now of all the times? You know, this is something I've studied a couple of times and wrestled with on different occasions, but why now? I think for so many of us, our experience through this situation is very different. We're all going through so many different things, whether that be losing your job, whether it be dealing with physical, mental ailments. Maybe it's just being alone. Maybe it's overwork, right? We're all going through so many different situations through this, and I think that's what keeps pushing me back to this idea of lamenting. When I think about what sermon to talk about, there's so many different situations people could be going through, but ultimately I think there's one kind of practice or solution that we need to get better at and be more aware of that could help us through whatever it is that we're going through. I think it's a good thing for us to express any of the sadness or frustrations or concerns and questions that we have through this time to God. I think that's a healthy thing for us to do. But lamenting is not just crying and whining about your problems. There's something that's unique about lamenting, and that's what I want us to look at. We're not just crying and whining about whatever the situation is, but instead, when we study the Bible, what we find out is that what's unique about lamenting as opposed to these other things is that lamenting comes with a belief that God hears whatever it is that we take to Him, even if it is such a complaint or a cry like that. I wanted to look starting at Psalm 34, and I think it kind of drives this point home a little more, but Psalm 34, starting in verse 17, says, "When the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all." As we go through this idea of lamenting, I want to share a couple just little snippets from these. Most of these are going to come from the Psalms, even though there's laments elsewhere in the Bible. But I want us to really wrestle with this idea and come to understand it a little better. See, anybody can cry or whine, about their problems and just, vent to whoever it is that are around. In fact, there's probably a lot of people that are doing that right now. But to faithfully lament is uniquely Christian. To doing it in a way that shows faith and honor to God. And this is something that's very unique, and that's what I want us to look at this morning. Jesus himself, when he was on the cross, he actually lamented. He quoted essentially Psalm 22, part of that. It's this cry out to God. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That, if you look at Psalm 22, is a lament. So this morning I want us to look at these laments, and I want us to learn maybe some of the keys of it and what it takes for us to be people that are more able and I guess trained in the way of lamenting. Well, when we first think about the idea of a lament, there's a lot of different scholars that break it down in a lot of different ways. But essentially, the basic four parts you see of any lament are this. One is to turn towards God. Two is to bring your complaint. Three is to ask boldly for help. And four is to choose to trust. This is kind of what we see when we break down different laments. Most of them have these four pieces. And just like we talked about with crying and whining, see, that's only one part of what it truly means to lament. Now, what I want to do is I want to go through these step by step, and hopefully through this process we can learn a little more about what it means to lament. Now, I am not some person that studied this a lot in my life, and in fact, this is very little of kind of the world of studying what lament is. But I wanted to give this to us because personally, I felt like this is something I needed to learn more about. This is something I need to be better at. This is something that could help me through whatever difficult circumstance I may be going through. And so this morning I wanted to go through these step by step, hopefully to benefit you, and I thought it was beneficial to me to kind of go through this process. But the first thing is turn towards God. Have you ever been in a relationship or a situation where communication just broke down? You know, there's a lot of different movie quotes and different things like that where you kind of see this happen. But I think when you think through your own experience, think of a time where maybe by choice there was some kind of rift between two people, and eventually that communication just breaks down. And what happens when that communication breaks down is whatever rift that was there actually grows. It doesn't have a chance to heal. It's like an open wound without any kind of medicine or healing that was going on there. See, the truth is it's a bigger issue to let frustrations like that fester than to openly deal with it. The first step of any good lament is taking whatever frustrations that we feel, being honest about them, and turning towards God with those frustrations and those questions. Psalm 39, verses 1 through 4. I said, I will guard my ways, that I may not sin with my tongue. I will guard my mouth with a muzzle, so long as the wicked are in my presence. I was mute and silent, and I held my peace to no avail, and my distress grew worse. My heart became hot within me. As I mused, the fire burned. Then I spoke with my tongue. O Lord, make me know my end, and what is the measure of my days? Let me know how fleeting I am. See, in this lament, the psalm writer actually says, look, I kept it to myself. And what did I get from that? Verse 2, my distress grew worse. My heart became hot within me. As I mused, the fire burned. Then what did he do? He spoke with his tongue. Now the key, just like we talked about, the key to why this is a Christian thing is he didn't just blabber this out to everybody, but instead he turned to God. See, we don't want to go from holding our tongue to just telling everybody about it and just sharing it on whatever avenue and thing that we can get. But instead, the key is to talk to God about it first. See, whenever we have these things, the first place we should take it is to God. Now, none of us are perfect. In fact, we've probably taken a lot of our issues a lot of other places. But what really is helpful about lament is realizing that God is ready to hear those things. He's waiting for us to share those with Him. A lot of times we'll go and take it several other places and then bring it to God. But the key is that we take it to God. When we have these frustrations, when we have these questions, when we have doubts like we talked about in our last sermon, when we have all these things, it's important to know that God is waiting and ready for us to take that to Him. It's a big step to restoring that communication, to restoring the relationship. Just like those relationships where you're in, where the communication breaks down, the same thing can happen between God. When we allow those frustrations just to sit in there and not do anything about, we're really just allowing that wound to fester and not trying to work towards healing with whatever it is that we're going through. So the first part of a good lament is to turn towards God. Not allow that barrier to stay there, but instead to reach out and take it to Him and start this process of healing. Now, the second part of this is to bring your complaint. To bring whatever that complaint is towards God. And you know, you think about like, well, what kind of things can we take to God? And the list is a lot longer, but I just wanted to give you a quick little list here from some of the first couple of lament psalms, just to see the variety of things that are lamented about in the psalms towards God. If you look at Psalm 6, lamenting for mercy and forgiveness from sins. You know, the psalm writer sinned, but he's asking God for mercy and forgiveness. Psalm 12, to correct the lying and injustice of the leaders in that day and time, right? There's corrupt leaders. They're lying. They're doing all these things that are unjust. And they cry out to God saying, why would you allow this to happen? Psalm 13, strength to persevere through difficulties, right? Whatever difficult situation, crying out to God, saying, God, help me through this. Psalm 31, deliver me from my enemies. Don't let my enemies overtake me. Psalm 39, perspective in a time of confusion. Right? You can look at these and you can just see how applicable all these are. Psalm 44 is actually God's people expressing feelings of rejection from God, right? By God. We mentioned Psalm 22 earlier that Jesus cried out from the cross, right? That feeling of rejection, feeling like, God, why have you left me like this? Why are you not listening to me? Why does it seem like you're not even there? These are all things that the psalm writer alone, not to mention other laments, takes to God. All of these different things we can take to God. And I think this is one thing that if you've been raised in the church, this part of this seems really weird. We kind of think about the other three parts of lament and we're like, oh yeah, turn towards God, ask boldly for help, choose to trust. All those things we feel really comfortable with, but we really hesitate to bring a complaint to God. When you look at some of the language, some of us would feel uncomfortable to say that. But I think the reason for that is we do that because of this idea of respect and reverence, where, God deserves our respect and He deserves reverence. But see, I think the problem is we can't just keep these things to ourselves. I mean, think about how silly that is. If we never openly talk about it, you think about it. God doesn't know your thoughts. God knows your heart. God knows everything that is going on within you. When we don't openly talk about these things honestly, how silly is that? God already knows about it, and yet we keep it to ourselves. We're only doing ourselves trouble. We're allowing that wound to get more infected and open and just never allowing that the chance to heal. But we need to learn to be honest with God in prayer. Yes, we want respect and reverence, but yes, God allows for honesty. When you read some of these laments, that's where I think we start in this process. But when you read these laments, some of the language would probably shock you. When you think about some of the things that they ask God for, they complain to God for, they're things that we probably wouldn't feel comfortable saying. But I think through working through these laments, we learn to balance between respect and honesty. We learn to balance between reverence and truly opening up our hearts to God. When you look at these laments, sure, there's a lot of things that we're like, man, can you say that to God? But I think God allows that to be in the Bible to show us that, hey, God's a big boy. He can handle it. Now, don't forget all the rest of these parts, right? We can't just openly complain to God without having these other parts, because this is what it means to faithfully lament. But see, we have to be open and honest with God about whatever it is that we feel frustration or question or doubts for. And that's where I think that a lot of us, especially those that are raised in the church, I think that's where we fall short. We don't feel comfortable to do that. But I think these laments can almost be permission to say, hey, be honest with God. Because He already knows what's going on, but talk to Him about it. Be honest and bring those things to God. Don't keep them to yourself. The third thing you do after this is be willing to ask boldly for help. We talked about last week, right? That idea of, the doubting that was talked about in those different verses. It was doubting while asking for something, right? It's that idea of, well, I'm going to ask God for that, but I'm not really counting on that. I'm going to go off and I'm going to hedge my bets, right? I'm going to diversify. I'm going to ask God, but then I'm also going to ask, another God or idol of the world, right? That's the kind of thing that that's not at all acceptable in God's eyes. Don't be that kind of person that asks God for things, but you have no, qualms like, yeah, He's not going to do that, right? But one thing we got to remember is this doesn't mean that we're not condemned for asking sheepishly, right? With this kind of timidity. In fact, that was the story we shared last week, is that the one of the father that asked Him and said, if you can, and Jesus kind of responded like, if I can, He's like trying to show him that's silly, right? God is able to do all these things. And then He follows that up by saying, Lord, I believe, help me with my unbelief. Well, there's that honesty again, right? There's that willingness that, sure, if we have any faith, just that faith the size of a mustard seed, we still take that to God. But we have to ask boldly for help. Just like that father that was willing to ask for help with his faith. Just like the different requests made of Jesus in His walk, right? We have to go to God willing and knowing that He is able to do so much more than even we think or ask. But Psalm 31, verse 18. This is one I thought would be a good example of kind of what it means to ask boldly. And I think you'll see here in a second. But Psalm 31, verse 18, let the lying lips be mute, which speak insolently against the righteous in pride and contempt. Just think about that. He's asking, he's saying, look, the lips out there that are spreading these lies, just silence them. Just make them no more. Their pride, their contempt, they're doing all this for all these wrong reasons. Just silence them. Let them be mute. Let them never to speak again. Think about our world today. If you're like me, this whole being shut up in your house, I've had to get my news from actual somewhat news sources. And man, I cannot stand it. Because no matter where you go, where you look, everyone has their agenda. Everyone has this it's not hard to see. It's right there on the surface that they just, for whatever reason, they're bending things one way or the other. And it drives me bananas. Is this not, beside learning to lament this, is this not something we should be praying for? God, look, all this lies that's out there, all this false information that's out there, just make it stop. Just make it quit. So many people in the world are driven to extremes by this stuff that they're watching and they're listening to. Is this not something we should be doing? Now, back to this idea of lament. He didn't ask for, would you help them to maybe not lie so much? He didn't ask for, something silly, but instead it was this bold claim. Look, let them be mute. Let the lies be no more. Now, I think for us, when we hear that, we don't usually talk to God that way. And I think part of it is because we don't want to put some sort of expectation on God for miracles, right? We don't want to, when times are tough, sure, we'll ask for something that seems miraculous, but we kind of hesitate for things like that. And I don't know that that's right. But just to kind of put your mind at ease, when you look in the world around you, you probably don't see a lot of things that are just, from every angle, every perspective, looks like a miracle, right? There's a lot of things that miracles tend to look a little more average and a little more normal. But I want you to think about, the good old saying that, my dad always said to me, and a lot of good, generational parents said this: there's more than one way to skin a cat. Right? There's more than one way for a problem to be solved. God doesn't have to just miraculously sew all the lips of anyone that tells lies in the world, right? If that was the case, a lot of us would have our lips sewn because at some point or another we told a lie. But God could also help people to see the deception and to see those lies that are out there. And then in that way, people quit listening to them. People quit watching the sources that they can see are obviously biased. People are looking for, unbiased truth. And honestly, there's only one place you're going to find that in the Bible. But beside the point, there are more than one way for God to work. And I think we have to start asking more boldly, because God gets to decide whether it's some miraculous thing for His glory or it's something that's less noticeable but still ultimately for His glory. When we ask things according for His will, it's not that God just drops us something out of the sky that we want, but instead we're asking things for His will for His glory, to bring Him glory. We still ask these things that seem bold, that seem out there. God can decide whether and how and what that looks like when He answers them. We still have to be asking boldly. And just think about that. When you dig through these laments, you're going to see a lot of requests that seems like, just like we said about complaining, some of the language there, they're going to seem like things that we would not be willing to ask for. But we need to learn from these laments and learn that we need to be asking for more bold things, for things that are maybe beyond what we feel comfortable to ask. Because if it's God's will, God can do it. How He does it, that's up to Him. But we need to be bold enough to ask no matter what the situation is. So first, we turn towards God. Second, we bring our complaint to God. We bring our frustrations to God. Third, we ask boldly for help. But then fourth, we choose to trust. We choose to trust in God. Psalm 74, starting in verse 10, says this: "How long, O God, is the foe to scoff? Is the enemy to revile your name forever? Why do you hold back your hand, your right hand? Take it from the fold of your garment and destroy them." Right? There's those two things, right? What's the complaint? Complaint's in verse 10. How long is the enemy going to be able to scoff? How long are people that are evil going to be able to brag about their ways, right? The ways that are contrary to God. Is the enemy just going to drag your name through the mud forever? Right? Wouldn't we just love for God to just appear and make Himself known so that there is no more doubt? There is no more people saying, oh, God's just made it. That would all end. We want that. And then He says in verse 11, right? Why do you hold back your hand? Why are you not doing something, God? These are these things that we feel uncomfortable saying sometimes. And then the request, take it from the fold of your garment and destroy them. That is not something we typically ask for. In fact, we kind of have a light stance on injustice a lot of times. But when you look at these laments, they are full well asking for God to bring about justice in whatever the situation is, to make things right, to uphold the righteous, to destroy the wicked. These are all things that are common within these lament psalms. Now, what do we say? God gets to decide how that is handled, right? Don't take vengeance for yourself. I will avenge. These are things we get from elsewhere in Scripture. But, we still have to bring this stuff boldly to God. Bring those frustrations. Bring those requests that seem outlandish. But then our part, the part that we do, is choose to trust in His timing. Choose to trust that however He sees fit to answer those questions, He's going to answer those questions. And this is where this passage really sinks in for us. So after those complaints, after that request, verse 12, "Yet God my King is from of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for creatures of the wilderness. You split open springs and brooks. You dried up ever-flowing streams. Yours is the day. Yours also is the night. You have established the heavenly lights in the sun. You have fixed all the boundaries of the earth. You have made the summer and the winter." See, even though the psalm writer brings those complaints and asks boldly for something that we may not feel comfortable asking for, but we should, he knows that ultimately he's going to trust in God. God has done things in the past to uphold justice, to bring about mercy and goodness across to people that need it. God has done all these things in the past. We have to go forward trusting that He's going to do it. Look at this beautiful model of prayer that we see through this, right? It's that prayer is this turning towards God. And yes, it's bringing these complaints. It's bringing these bold requests. But at the end of it, we walk away knowing God is going to take care of it. Time and time again, you see these in laments. They end on this note of, well, God's going to take care of it. I asked God about it, God's going to do it. It may not look like what I expect. I may not be able to go out and prophesy this is going to happen because I asked it. God's going to take care of it in His own time and in His own way. And you put your trust in that. It's that saying, I forget what movie it's come from, but if you're going to ask God for rain, you go out and you plant the seed. You go out and you till up the ground. You do everything because guess what? You've asked Him for it. He's going to take care of it in His own way and in His own time. I love the line of the disciples in John. After all the other disciples leave, right, Jesus turns to him and says, "Look, are you going to leave too?" And says, "Where are we going to go?" Right? You have the words of life. This is what this process of lament is. You get to the point where you realize, the world's not going to solve a lot of these issues. There's so many things that just continue to go on in the world. Injustice abounds, right? You just look at the news and you can find story after story of injustice out there. But laments are about taking that to God and taking those frustrations, taking those complaints, but yet knowing, hey, God's the only one that can do something about this. I'm going to take it to Him. I'm going to repair my relationship with Him. Maybe it is this personal thing between you and Him. Maybe it is a bigger picture thing. But laments can be used for all these different things. There's actually a whole category of laments that people study from the Psalm called community laments. When the church gets together and God's people get together and say, "Hey, why is this allowed to go on?" And voicing those kind of frustrations, voicing the brokenness that we see in the world. But ultimately, we come back to this note of faith. So many things in the world that are worth lamenting. You think about all the sicknesses that take life. Not just this virus. There's so many things in the world that just, without any kind of prejudice, just destroys many people's lives. You think about the corrupt leaders. We talked about that. The people who lie. These people that have such a platform for so many people to listen, but yet they're just lying, spewing lies out of their mouth. You think about the personal struggle that you may be going through, right? Or just in general, the brokenness of the world. There's so many things that are worth lamenting over. So many things that are worth turning to God and voicing our complaints and our frustrations and the brokenness that we see, and then asking God boldly to do something about it, but ultimately ending on this note of trust and hope and faith in God. This is what it means to truly lament. Not just cry, not just whine, but in the pattern that we see of the Bible, and the pattern that we see of those that put their faith in God, we truly lament. My prayer and my hope is that with this sermon and with you going out and you looking through these laments yourself, you taking some of these Psalms, and if you got a good study Bible, and maybe even some Bibles just kind of show this, but you can pretty quickly tell which one of them are laments. But just go through some of these laments and study through them. And my prayer is that by learning to lament, we grow in our faith, and ultimately we become more like Christ. We become more in tune with His will. That's one of the deep things about this lament. When we bring these frustrations to God, it's not like God doesn't see them. It's not like God Himself is not frustrated when evil is allowed in the world. Right? But it's about us being open and honest with God, and not keeping that to ourselves, not shutting down that form of communication, not separating ourselves from God in that way. We can be open and honest with Him. He can take it. He wants it, in fact. He wants us to be honest with Him. But we do it all with this faith. We begin it with faith, and we end it with faith. That's what it means to truly lament in the pattern that we see of the Bible. Now, I hope that this is something that you start to practice yourself. I hope that you wrestle with this, whether you're somebody that doesn't have faith. I think laments are a good way to get started in the faith. I think as you start to look through the Psalm, you see that a lot of the frustrations you have, you'll probably find in some of the laments of the Psalm. There's so many varieties of things that they took to God in this form of lament and prayer. And I hope that if you're somebody that's new in that faith, that you see that, hey, this is the journey of all of us. We all wrestle with these ideas, and we take those things to God. And ultimately what we find is that God gives us an answer that the world does not offer. God created the world, but He did not create the brokenness and the sin and the evil that we see in the world today. If you are a Christian, and this idea of lament and some of this is shocking to you, I pray that you look through these yourselves and you really think about what they're saying and wrestle with some of the language there, because I think it's something that we are really timid and really afraid to do out of respect and reverence for God. But I think we also got to realize that God wants us to be honest. We can't just ultimately be so respectful and so reverent that we're never honest with God. God doesn't want that kind of relationship with us. Instead, He wants us to be honest with Him. He wants us to be close with Him and have a deep relationship with Him. And that only comes through honest, open communication. So my prayer is that these laments help you to grow in your faith. And if you ever want to talk about this more, reach out to me. I'd love to study them with you. It's something that I find pretty fascinating myself. May the Lord bless you this week. May He keep you, and may His face shine upon you and give you peace. And as always, we look forward to our time to be together, whenever that is. And don't forget, mothers, stay around and check out our Mother's Day video. Thank you so much.